Hello everybody, this is Bill from TurboDial, and in this video we'll go in depth on the role of a session owner in the Dynamic Dial add-on. Dynamic Dial is the fully autonomous dialer in TurboDial. It brings simplicity for your calling agents while also bringing full control of the dialing sessions for your managers. And the session owner is a key role for accomplishing dialing effectiveness with Dynamic Dial. So here's the topics we're going to cover in this video. First of all, we're going to do an overview of the roles of session owner and calling agent. We'll go into some key concepts that are new with Dynamic Dial. Then we'll start talking through the session setup and go into the options for configuring your session in detail. Then we'll show you how to monitor session status, talk about some FCC regulations that apply to this, and we'll show you how to create Dynamic Dial dashboard reports. Okay, as a session owner, there are several elements for your role. First of all, you're going to set up the saved search in Infusionsoft and create the filters there that will accomplish pulling together the list of contacts you want to dial to. Next, you're going to want to configure the session options in TurboDial, and that's what this video goes into detail about. Then you'll load the list and become the session owner, and you'll assign agents to join the session and start making those calls. You'll be able to observe the session status and create dashboard reports to analyze how the session worked. The calling agent role is one where they will accept the dialing assignment from their manager, telling them what session they should be dialing to. They can configure some personal options inside of TurboDial for making those calls. There's not very many, only a couple. And then they can select the session and click join. From that point on, they are in their dialing cycle where they are talking to contacts and saving call outcomes. All right, there's some key concepts with Dynamic Dial that we want to talk through. The agent cycle, the differences between Dynamic Dial and Power Dial, which you may be familiar with, missed connections in Dynamic Dial and what those mean, the answer detect option, which is new with Dynamic Dial, and then answer detect along with missed connections and how they work together, and also this special case where there are no currently eligible numbers. All right, let's talk about the calling agent's cycle. They really only go through 3 different states, and in this diagram we're showing you the join button, which has a different label depending upon what state the calling agent is in. When the join button in TurboDial simply says join, that means they are not yet joined to a session. Then when they click that join button, the label on that button turns into a rolling circle, and now they are joined to the session and available to receive TurboDial calls. TurboDial at that point will start making calls because there's an available agent. When a call connects, that agent will start talking, they'll be connected, and their join button will now show a label which is a counting timer showing the number of seconds for the duration of the call so far. At the end of their call, they'll click the hang up button, and now that join button goes back to simply a join label because they are no longer joined. They're doing their follow-up work, such as saving the call outcome, and when they are done with that, they can go right back to the beginning, click the join button, and go through the cycle again. So that's the cycle that an agent goes through. They really have 3 possible states. Not joined, which means they are not available to accept a call. Joined, which means they are available and they're waiting for a call. Connected, which means they are talking on a call. That's the 3 states. When agents are available, TurboDial dials calls and keeps dialing calls while there are agents available. If a call times out with no answer, TurboDial hangs that call up and moves right on to the next contact. So as long as agents are available, TurboDial is dialing calls. If a call is answered, then it is connected to the agent who's been waiting the longest for a call. And if there is no available agent, then that call will become a missed connection. We'll talk some more in detail about missed connections. Dynamic Dial versus Power Dial. Now, you may be familiar with Power Dial from other use of TurboDial, and there's a similarity here. Both of them have a setting for simultaneous calls between 1 and 4. Let's actually look at that. Here's a TurboDial window. If you go over to the List Dial section in the Power Dial section of List Dial, you can see you can change Power Dial between 1 and 4. So you can have Power dial 4 simultaneous calls, or 3, 2, or 1. or you can turn it off. Well, in the case of dynamic dial, I'm getting ahead of myself for a second, but I'm going to show you in the options here, simultaneous attempts per agent, 1, 2, 3, or 4. That's very analogous. So they both have that 1 to 4 simultaneous calls setting. However, in PowerDial, it dials the number of calls for one agent and then stops dialing. And the first ringing call that gets answered is connected to the agent, and the remaining calls then are immediately dropped. If one of those remaining calls was answered before it got dropped, the person who answered that call is going to get dead air, and there will not be a recording played to that person. In the case of dynamic dial, it maintains 1 to 4 calls actively ringing for each available agent. Now, if you set your simultaneous calls to 4, and there are 3 agents available and waiting for calls, then dynamic dial is going to try to have 12 calls ringing. That's 3 times 4. And as calls time out because they're not answered, it will dial another call in order to keep your set number of calls ringing per agent. Any call that's answered then is connected to an agent if possible, and if there's no agent, that then gets sent to a recording. Calls then are dropped only when ringing times out. On PowerDial, calls were dropped as soon as the first call was answered. In the case of dynamic dial, they're dropped only when their ringing times out, and more calls are dialed to replace those dropped calls in order to maintain your set number of actively ringing calls per available agent. So dynamic dial is attempting to keep calls ringing in order to keep your agents talking to the prospects. So what's a misconnection? This is when a call is answered, but no agent is available to take the call. And in that case, a recording is played to the person or machine that answered the call. TurboDial keeps track of these and increments the missed connection count for that session. So how can there be a case where there is no agent available? So remember, TurboDial can dial anywhere from 1 to 4 calls per agent, depending upon what you've chosen in the setting. If you choose 2, 3, or 4, then multiple calls are dialed simultaneously, and if a call is answered and is connected to the only available agent, then if another call is answered, there is no agent available at that point, so that is a missed connection. If you choose 1, there will be no missed connections because there will never be more than 1 call ringing per available agent. Now there's another option that's new with dynamic dial called answer detect. This is a special Twilio technology that you can add to your calls. It is charged by Twilio at the cost of 3/4 of a cent per call. This technology attempts to determine if a human or a machine has answered the call, and Twilio claims that it's more than 80% accurate in accomplishing that. The differences in dynamic dial with answer detect are as follows. If you turn on answer detect, there's about a 2-second delay that's inserted after the call is answered. So when someone answers that call, they're going to hear silence while Twilio is taking about 2 seconds to try to determine, was this a machine or a human that answered the call? Now, if it's a human that answers, we'll connect that call to an agent. A human is going to usually accept that 2-second delay or so, and they'll wait for your agent to begin talking. But it's not optimal, and they will recognize that there was a delay there and that this is probably a marketing call. If it's a machine that answers, TurboDial is going to handle that call instead. If you have answer detect enabled, then rather than connecting that machine to your agent, TurboDial will wait for the beep, if it's an answering machine, and then play your misconnection recording. This is not considered to be a misconnection, as we've defined on the previous slide, but the same recording is used in this case and is played to the answering machine that answers. So if answer detect is off, then there is no detection performed when the call is answered, and the human that answers will not hear that delay of 1 or 2 seconds. Your agents, though, then will be connected to both humans and machines. In the case where you had answer detect on, we attempted to only connect your agents to humans, and machines were handled by automation. Without answer detect, your agents will be connected to both humans and machines, and that means your agents are less available to connect to calls, and that could lead to a few more missed connections than otherwise. If a human answers, then it's connected to an agent. That human hears your agent begin talking right away. And if a machine answers, well, that's also connected to an agent. Your agent then has the job of detecting that this is a machine, and then your agent can wait for the beep and then cause TurboDial to play a pre-recorded message onto that answer machine. We're still going into the details of these key elements and key concepts of dynamic dial. Let's talk now about the relationship between answer detect and missed connections. So with answer detect on, if a human answers and the agent is available, there will be about a 2-second delay for the system to determine that this was a human, and then the call will be connected to the agent. So that's a success. The green arrow here is kind of a pale green, but to indicate this is a success. It's not the best thing because there was a couple second delay, but it was a success. With answer detect off, if a human answers and the agent is available, then it's a quick connect from the human to your agent. That's a bright green arrow because that's the best scenario you can get. Now with answer detect on and a machine answers, at this point the system and TurboDial will automatically wait for the beep and then play the recording out that you've designated onto that answering machine. Even though there was an agent available, the agent didn't have to deal with that call. TurboDial handled it without your agent needing to get involved. And so that's a great success also. If answer detect was off though, the machine answers and your agent is available, well, that call is going to be connected to your agent. Your agent then must manually wait for the beep and then trigger the playback recording to be played back on the answering machine. There's about a gray arrow. It's not really a great success, it's not a failure, but it did take some of your agent's time. So these two scenarios up here where there are agents available for human answers and machine answers, these are the more common scenarios that agents will be available. But there's another set of scenarios where there are no agents available. Let's walk through those. So if a human answers with no agent available, if answer detect is on, that's called a missed connection. And TurboDial is going to automatically play your missed connection recording to that human. That wouldn't be considered a success because the human who answered did not really want to be talking to your recording. If answer detect is off, the same thing happens. It's a missed connection, and TurboDial will autoplay your recording to the human because no agent was available. If a machine answers and there's no agent available, well, that's okay if answer detect is on because with answer detect, TurboDial will be able to wait for the beep and then play your recording onto their answer machine. And so that's a success. But if answer detect is off and the machine answers with no agent available, that's a missed connection. We can't tell if a machine or a human answered, and so we have to count that as a missed connection. We will play the recording, but we won't wait for the beep to do it because we cannot detect the beep. And so that recording playback starts before the beep. So this would not be considered a good success. So if you look overall at the greens and the reds, answer detect does have some advantage, that's for sure, but you're going to want to consider the trade-offs between using answer detect on or disabled. Now there's another case with dynamic dial where there are no currently eligible numbers. This happens after you've been dialing into a dialing session for a while, and based upon the options that you've set up, you get to the point where there are still numbers that can be dialed and haven't been connected to yet, but they're not currently eligible to be dialed based upon your options settings. When that happens, an alert gets displayed to your calling agents that basically tells them to please hang up once they're done with their current call, because at this point there are no further numbers to be called. You can check the details in the status window. We'll show you more about the status window. But in the status window, you can see reflected there that at the moment there are no numbers eligible to be attempted, and that there are some numbers that will become eligible after some time has passed. And we'll talk some more about how that can happen. So contacts who have not yet connected to a call will become eligible, but only after some time has passed, and that's going to be based upon how you've set up your options in dynamic dial. Let's go into session setup. The goal here is to configure your dialing session to achieve a good pace of connections to your calling agents while also respecting your prospects. Well, what does that mean, respecting your prospects? Your prospects can feel disrespected if they feel like you are intentionally ringing their phone repetitively. Several times a day they get a call from you. They don't know why you keep calling back. Or if they feel like you are terminating calls before they can answer them. Or if you are connecting them to a machine when you call them rather than a person. Those are scenarios where your prospects will not feel respected. We're going to go into how you're going to set this up. Let's start with what your pre-setup steps are. You're going to create your saved search in Infusionsoft, And as you do that, you can decide what numbers you're going to want to dial to. So in most cases, you've got just a single phone number in your contact records, and that's in the phone 1 field. But if you have a phone 2 or maybe even a phone 3 field in your contact records, you can add those to the saved search. And if you do, then TurboDial will include those as numbers to be dialed. You should decide what contact information from the contact record should be displayed in the info pop-up. The info pop-up is something else we'll talk about in a few minutes. You want to include those contact fields right now as columns in the saved search. An example might be the person notes that would have maybe perhaps some recent documentation about what this customer is interested in or what other history with this customer has been. Or maybe you have other custom fields that are relevant. You're going to want to create your recorded messages in TurboDial. First of all, you're going to need one for your missed connections. And that same recorded message gets played when an answer machine is detected. You're going to want another recorded message that agents should play back if they encounter a voicemail machine. You could use that same missed connections recording for that, or you may give them another one. You should determine what call outcomes you want your agents to use based upon their list they're dialing to, and you may need to set up some call outcomes. And you may need to create some call outcome automation in Infusionsoft so that you are tracking and following up on these calls correctly. Let's bring in a TurboDial window on the right-hand side so we can track this more closely and walk through it. The session setup details is going to start by, once you have set up your save search in Infusionsoft, you're going to want to relaunch TurboDial so that TurboDial can pick up and recognize, as in the list here of saved searches, it will include the saved search that you just set up. Next, you're going to want to choose the caller ID that everyone will be using. Every call made in this dynamic dial session will use the same caller ID number, so you choose that here. Next, you're going to choose the recorded message that you want to use for missed connections, and you're going to choose that right here in your recorded message selector in TurboDial. And then thirdly, you're going to choose the saved search that you want to dial to for this session. That's also set up already on the TurboDial side as all hot leads is the one we're using for this example. Now there's an options button at the bottom here, and you're going to click that, and that will open a window of options to be configured. Let's start walking through these options. Record calls. This is the one place where you can decide if you want these calls to be recorded or not. If you click this box, then calls will be recorded. Otherwise, they will not be. The number of attempts per day. This gets in now to the options where you're starting to configure about how you want to pursue your prospects. How gently can you treat them at the same time with having good success of reaching them? It defaults to a value of any number of attempts per day. So as often as you can get to them, it will try. You may want to limit that though and say, I don't want to be too incessant in my calling, and so we're going to limit it to just 3 attempts per day, for example. The number of rings per attempt. This is how many rings, approximately, that TurboDial is going to wait for an answer before ending that call attempt and moving on to the next contact. It starts out set at 5, so we're going to start dialing somebody and wait for 5 rings for them to answer. If they don't answer, we're going to hang up and move on to the next contact. If you set this number lower, you're going to reduce the number of answer machines that you reach. And if you set the number of higher, you're going to increase the number of answer machines that you reach. So you can kind of think about that. If you want to be reaching answer machines to leave your message on answer machines, that's okay. Set this up a little bit higher. If you want to avoid answer machines, set this a little bit lower, but now you're going to be starting to disrespect your prospects because you're going to be ringing their phone but hanging up before they can get to it. So there's a trade-off to be made there. Okay, next, let's go on to wait to retry. This is the interval ranging between 6 minutes and 24 hours for how long you want to wait between the attempts for each contact. If you try a contact at 10 a.m. and you've got wait to retry set at 2 hours, they won't become eligible to be tried again until noon. And then at noon, if they get tried again, they won't be eligible again to be tried until 2 p.m. So that's how 2 hours works. You can set this as low as 6 minutes or as high as once per day. And once a contact is connected to your agent or their answer machine is connected to your agent, TurboDial removes them from the list so they are no longer eligible regardless of these settings. Calling window is one that's not as powerful because it depends upon the area code. What it does is it says you can set a calling window of hours of the day between which you are eligible to make calls. So if someone's area code, let's say, is 312, which is in Central Time Zone, TurboDial during the dynamic dial session will consider them eligible for calls between 9 a.m. Central and 5 p.m. Central. But if they're in 212 area code, which is East Coast, that's 9 a.m. Eastern until 5 p.m. Eastern. The trouble with this is that area codes aren't that reliable because people will often move across country and keep their phone number. And so someone with an East Coast area code may be on the West Coast and operating in a different time zone. Simultaneous attempts per agent. This is the number that's analogous to the setting in PowerDial of 1 to 4. This says how many calls TurboDial will attempt to keep actively ringing for every agent you have available to receive calls. 1 means if you have 1 agent available, then TurboDial is going to keep 1 call ringing until no more agents are available. 2 means if you have 1 agent available, then TurboDial will make 2 calls and keep 2 calls ringing until a call gets connected to that agent. And if you have 2 agents available and you've set it to 2 simultaneous attempts, that means there will be 4 calls that TurboDial will keep ringing until both agents become no longer available. So you're going to choose 1 or 2 here in order to reduce the number of missed connections that you get, because the lower number here results in a better chance that an agent will be available when a call gets answered. However, that can result in some longer wait times for your agents, and so if you set this to 3 or 4, you're going to have a lot less waiting for your agents. They'll be connected to calls pretty quickly after they become available, but you will also have more missed connections. Okay, answer detect. We talked about that a few minutes ago. This is where you select this box if you want answer machines to be detected. And when an answer machine is detected, TurboDial will play your recorded message to them rather than connecting that call to an agent. With this box checked to be enabled, TurboDial is going to try to connect your agents only to calls that have been answered by humans. But as we said before, that does introduce about 2 seconds of delay after the call gets answered before TurboDial gets to connect to that human. And that 2 seconds is when Twilio is doing the detection to determine if this is a human or a machine. Now, it's important to note, and we'll talk some more about this in a few minutes, but TurboDial may force answer detect to be enabled in your dialing session if too many missed connections are occurring. We mentioned before that TurboDial keeps track of the missed connections in this session. And if you're starting to get too many missed connections, TurboDial may force that to be enabled, because that helps TurboDial count missed connections more accurately, and it helps us reduce the number of missed connections that occur. Notify on answer with no agent available. This setting means if there is a missed connection, then TurboDial will send a screen pop alert to the TurboDial panel for every user in your account who has at one point or another joined this dialing session. So in other words, the calling agents that are working in this dialing session will all see this alert. And this alert means that we just attempted a call to somebody and they answered, but there was no agent available to take that call. And so we send this alert, since this option is enabled, we'll send that alert out. And what the agents should do when they see that is they should click the blue arrow to claim that call as soon as they can. Now, if they're on a call, they can't do it, but when they can hang up and they still see this alert on their TurboDial panel, they should click this blue arrow. That will claim that call, and it'll hide this alert from the other agents on the team. And then that claiming agent should call this contact back right then, because there should be a good chance of reaching them if a human was answered but wasn't connected to an agent. Note that with this set on, notify on answers with no agent available. If that is enabled, these alerts will be displayed, but prospects will not be attempted again. They're no longer eligible to be attempted for calls, since TurboDial turned that contact over to your agents to call them directly. So in a sense, they were taken out of the dialing session and turned over to be manually called by your agents. This can also be called a missed connection alert. So generally, you're going to probably want to keep that off, but sometimes you may feel like it's a really good opportunity to try to reach people. If you know they answered but no one was available to talk to them, that's a good contact to try to reach right back on the phone. Okay, the last option to be configured here is called Use Local Presence to Assign Caller ID. You won't see this option on your list if you don't have the Local Presence add-on in your account, and so if you don't see it there, that's why. If you do have it, you can select that to enable it, and if you do enable it, then Local Presence will be used in order to display a caller ID that matches the number that's being called if a caller ID in your account is available. You can see more information about local presence at the turbodial.biz homepage. The last thing on the options screen is the info pop-up columns. So when you set up your Save Search in Infusionsoft, you designated a set of columns that should be included in that Save Search. These columns all appear here. These are the columns that will be displayed in the info pop-up that the calling agent will see if they enable it on their dialing session. And this can give the calling agent some additional information about the contact so that they'll have it visible right in front of them when the contact answers the call. So that gives them a way to get a quick reference towards some background information, like who's the owner, in this case, the date this contact entered your system. You could have notes, your person notes included here, or other custom fields that might be relevant to the dialing session. You could include those columns in your Save Search. So this shows you the columns that are included in your Save Search, but it does not give you the means to change them here. If you want to change that set of columns, then you do need to go back to Infusionsoft, change the Save Search there, and save the changes, and then come back and reload and start over again. Okay, we're back to this part of the session setup. At this point, you're ready to click the Load button and load your session. And when you do that, you're going to need to wait a little bit while TurboDial brings in that list from Infusionsoft. A larger list was going to take more time than a shorter list. Once you've loaded this session now, there's a copy of that list in TurboDial, which is now separate and distinct from the copy that's in Infusionsoft. And so any changes in Infusionsoft will not be reflected in the TurboDial copy. So you now have the potential of diverging between how the list looks in Infusionsoft versus the list in TurboDial. If that's a problem for you, you may be able to use the list autosync utility that TurboDial provides in order to keep the two sides in sync. Once the load is complete, you will see that the load button now changes to join. And since you are the session owner, you see the reset button too, and you see a status button. This is a dialing session that is now ready for your calling agents to join and begin making calls. Let's talk about this session status. If you click this button right here, it opens a status window, and it looks like this, and we'll go through some of the contents of that window. At the top of that window, we've given you the name of the list that you're seeking status on, who's the owner, when this list was loaded, and then total list size. Now this is the number of phone numbers in the list. It's not the number of contacts. It could be greater than or less than the number of contacts in your list. For example, if you bring in a list of contacts and some of those contacts are missing a phone number in their phone field, then the number of phone numbers listed here is going to be less than the actual number of contacts in your list. On the other hand, if you've designated in your Save Search that you want both the phone 1 and the phone 2 field to be included, then the total number of phone numbers in your list is going to be greater than the number of contacts in your list. So this number here is not the same as the number of contacts in your list. Walking through this just shows you how many attempts, including reattempts, phone calls have been made so far. And of course, we just started this session, and so the number is 0. Total numbers attempted is going to tell you how many phone numbers have been attempted. Some of them may have been attempted more than once. And so this number is going to be smaller often than the number above it. And this means phone numbers, the total number of phone numbers that have been attempted. Continuing on with these statistics, you see the numbers that were answered and connected to an agent. And the answer to no agent available, that means this is a missed connection. So that's a particular important one to take note of. Those are your missed connections. If you use answer detect, then we are able to count how many answering machines answered. And we will also give you a count for how many times did we make a dial, but then it timed out with no answer. It's important to see how many numbers have not yet been attempted. That tells you how much of your list is yet to be attempted. And there's, if you've got a total list of 103 and you've only got 10 left to be attempted, you're almost at the end of your list. Numbers eligible to be attempted now is also important to look at, because based upon the options that you've set, for example, the calling window that you set, the amount of time to wait between attempts, and the number of attempts per day, those can all affect the number of phone numbers that are eligible to be attempted. And likewise, numbers that have not yet connected, but because of your options, such as the wait time between attempts, they may be waiting to become eligible, and it's after some time has passed, they will be eligible. That number will be reflected here. That's a good one to watch also, because it tells you how much of your list can be tried again after some time has passed. Let's talk about the reset button. The reset button is available to the session owner. It would not be available to your calling agents. If you click the reset button, it will end the session and cancel all subsequent dialing activity in that session. It will also delete the saved copy of the list in TurboDial so that TurboDial is no longer holding onto a copy of that saved search. And after a reset, the only thing that remains from that dialing session are the note records that TurboDial created, the call outcomes that your people left as they made their calls, and the automation that those call outcomes triggered. That's what's going to remain at the end of that session. So that's what you can build your dashboard reports on. The status window, for example, is no longer available after you've reset the list. So you're going to reset when you're ready to stop dialing to that list. That's when you would use reset. Or in some cases, you may decide you want to bring in a fresh copy of the list from Infusionsoft because you know there have been many changes in the list. So you can reset to purge the list from TurboDial and then do a load to bring that list back in to TurboDial. Okay, there are some FCC requirements here that we should talk about. A telemarketer, I'm going to quote the 2003 TCPA Act. A telemarketer may abandon during a 30-day period no more than 3% of the calls answered by a person. That's a human. And they must deliver a pre-recorded identification message when abandoning a call. So in the dynamic dial, a missed connection is the same as an abandon. If the FCC were counting your calls, your missed connections would be counted by them as abandons. However, if a machine did answer the call, if you don't have answer detect enabled, then TurboDial will count it as a missed connection if no agent was available. But if it really was a machine that answered, the FCC does not consider that to be an abandon. So that's a nuance associated with the difference between how TurboDial works and how this law is set up. But you need to be compliant with these abandoned call law. So what you should do, first of all, any good practice with calling a list is you should call a list of leads who have opted into something that you've offered rather than cold calling to a purchased list. If you're going to be cold calling to a purchased list, you want to be very careful with your settings in TurboDial so that you don't miss a lot of connections. You're going to want to use a missed connection recording that identifies you because that keeps you in compliance with the law. And you're going to want to set your rings per attempt to be a little bit higher so that you're not hanging up on people before they get a chance to answer. And lastly, you can certainly set your simultaneous attempts per agent to 1 because if there's only one simultaneous attempt per agent, then you will always have an agent available to connect to a call that is answered. Or if you do have it set to greater than 1, use answer detect. In order to help you stay in compliance with this law, TurboDial does some things. First of all, we count your missed connections, and after 10 of them have occurred in this dialing session, TurboDial is going to automatically enable answer detect in your session if you don't already have it enabled. So it will override your setting in order to enable answer detect. And then as it keeps counting, if it sees that on an ongoing basis you're having more than 3% missed connections, then TurboDial is going to reduce the number of simultaneous attempts per agent that you've set so that fewer calls are being made per available agent. So it's going to override your setting to reduce that number. So your settings get overridden in order to help you stay in compliance, and you'll be able to open the status window and note in big red labels here if you've got any overrides in effect. TurboDial will show you in your status window right there that some overrides have been applied in order to keep you in compliance. With those overrides, though, you should be able to stay in compliance with these laws. Okay, let's go through some important notes. First of all, TurboDial will not traverse your list in any order. People sometimes expect that TurboDial is going through a safe search in some order. You should not expect that because there's such a variation between eligible numbers based upon the criteria that you've specified in your options. So the order may even seem random to you. The My Tasks Do list is a special type of list. This one here. Every calling agent dialing to a My Tasks Do session will be dialing a unique list of their own assigned tasks. So it's not possible to share a My Tasks Do session between multiple agents. The calling agent will always be the session owner. So you can use dynamic dial with My Tasks Do, but the person making the calls will also be the session owner. There is a global option in TurboDial called Restrict Views to Owned Records. If you've enabled that in your account, then the session will be loaded. When a session is loaded into Dynamic Dial, that's going to be loaded only with contacts who are owned by the session owner. And for that reason, the session owner is the only person who's allowed to be a calling agent and join that session. So if you want to use Dynamic Dial, you're likely going to want to turn this setting to off. List AutoSync is another utility in TurboDial that you may choose to use. It helps you keep your Infusionsoft version of your list in sync with the TurboDial version of your list, and you can see more information about that in the support guides at TurboDial. Local presence, we've already mentioned it, helps you improve your answer rates by matching the area code of your caller ID up with the area code of the person you're calling. And that helps you also avoid getting caught in some of this carrier spam filters. If you're making a lot of calls, you definitely want to look into local presence to add it to your TurboDial account. Call newest first. Okay, so if you use the date created column as one of the columns in your saved search, if you include that column in your saved search, TurboDial will make note of that you did that. And it will use date created to look for the most recently created record when it's choosing numbers to dial. And it does that on the granularity of one day. So records created on the same day have the same priority. If you have a record created today, that will be dialed before a record that was created yesterday. But two records created on the same day, like one in the morning and one in the afternoon, you cannot be sure which one will be dialed first. But it is a good way to make sure that TurboDial with Dynamic Dial is always dialing to your newest records first. Dynamic Dial creates note records for all of the calls that it's making. And this is a list of the titles for those note records. This is important because these titles is pretty much all you need to be able to create most of your saved reports and dashboard reports that you will use in Infusionsoft to manage your Dynamic Dial sessions. If a Dynamic Dial call attempt is made but no answer, that's simply given this title, TurboDial Dynamic Dial Attempt. But for calls that are answered and connected, they get this phrase Dynamic Dial Call, or if you've got the recording option set to on, it'll be Dynamic Dial Call -recorded. Or in the case where a Dynamic Dial call was connected to an agent, but the call was answered on the other end by an answer machine and the agent leaves a message, then this is the note title you'll get. Dynamic Dial Call left message and the name of the recording that was left. If you've got answer detect enabled, then when an answer machine answers the call, this will be the note title. Dynamic Dial Machine Answer. Missed connections are given that note title. And in the case where we recognize that a number is bad or has failed for some reason, it's given that note title. So those note titles is pretty much all you need to know to be able to create your reports, because here's some examples. If you want to get a report on your connected calls in Infusionsoft, then here's the filters you would set up in your task note report in Infusionsoft. Using in the search tab, the main search field would simply use the value of TurboDial Dynamic Dial Call. With that filter and that search phrase, you'll pick up your connected calls. If you want to instead pick up the missed connections and have a report showing your missed connections, then you could use the phrase TurboDial Dynamic Dial Missed. That will give you your missed connections. Okay, everybody. Thanks for working through this with us. Just gone through Dynamic Dial and all of the procedures for a session owner to set up a Dynamic Dial session. Happy dialing, everybody.